The next office?
The next one I'll talk about is the Office of Environmental Enforcement, which has 100 staff and has a sole focus on the enforcement of environmental legislation. And when I joined the agency in 2002, we did a bit of a restructuring around the agency, not just for the sake of restructuring, but because we felt that that the public, some politicians, and certainly the European Union were beginning to doubt whether Ireland was complying fully with and enforcing all the environmental law. So we felt that it was better to set up a specific Office of Environmental Enforcement under the aegis of the EPA, who would have the sole remit of enforcing environmental legislation. And so it does that across two areas. One is enforcing the terms of our own licences, and the second one is our supervisory and enforcement role around local authorities and public authorities.
Oh, good.
So they're divided into two areas then, the public and the EPA licenses.
And we'll come back to that issue about the oversight of the local authorities.
Okay.
What's this? There's 400 and some in that office?
No, 100. There's 100
sorry,
people.
And are most of those with the enforcing the licensing?
Most of them are, but it's not like it's 60-40 or something like that. It's not huge.
Okay, and then the third office?
And then a third office is the Office of Environmental Assessment. And in that office we also have the responsibility, you see, for all the monitoring of ambient environment, so air quality, water quality, reports to the UN, reports to the EU. So that office does all of that kind of stuff, and also has a very big role in the research and development, which is very important for what we do.
And how many in that office?
In OEA there are 118 people.
118.
They also provide laboratory services.
Oh, they do?
Yeah.
You have in-house laboratories?
We have. We are decentralised in that our headquarters is in Wexford and not in Dublin, and we are regionalised around the country. So we have 5 laboratories around the country, one here in Dublin, one in Kilkenny, Monaghan, Cork and Castlebar. So we have labs around the country where we need to have them.
And the environmental assessment is funding the research that a number of people are doing for the agency?
Yes, the Environment Assessment Office funds that, yeah.
Because in fact in this issue, the first issue of the Irish Environment, we have a summary of the report that John Sweeney and others did on the local impacts from climate change, which is very helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, and John has done a number of reports funded by the EPA over the years, and has actually become quite a real expert in climate change. A lot, I would say, through the funding that he has received from us. Before the EPA had money to put into environmental research, there was very little money at all in environmental research in Ireland. And people who were working in that area soldiered on bravely with no funds. Since we've come into the funding area, I think most of the researchers will tell you that they're quite happy with the way in which we've distributed funds around the system and really built up capacity and capability within Ireland in terms of environmental protection.
And the last office is? The
last office then is our Office of Communications and Corporate Services. So it provides all the support that we need in terms of finance, human resources, the usual things that keep a company ticking over, and our communications office. Because we have we do a lot of communications. We try to be as open and as transparent as we can. We have a lot of material on the website, but we also service the press, the public, conferences. And also we run an education and communication campaign with schools and at various conferences and exhibitions around the country.
And how many staff are within that office?
In OCCS, can't think of the number. There's a much smaller office, probably about 35 or so. About
35 or so, okay.
Yeah.
Mary, I thought it might be helpful to the audience for us to take a walk through a case study of a particular problem, and for hypothetical, we'll assume that some citizen observes some illegal dumping, what appears to be illegal dumping. Who do they call and how do they process that information?
Well, if somebody sees illegal dumping somewhere in the countryside, we'll say, the correct people to call are the local authorities, the relevant local authority in that area. But everybody doesn't know who to call, and sometimes people immediately think, oh, Environmental Protection Agency, let's ring them, which is a perfectly fine thing to do. It's probably what I'd do if I saw it. So what we've done is set up a complaints line, which is serviced 24 hours a day. So anybody who sees illegal dumping anywhere can ring this number 24/7. It doesn't matter who they think they're talking to. The people at the end of the line will put them through to possibly the next morning, it has to be said, but we'll take their complaint and put it through to the local authority in the first instance. Now, let's say the local authority either doesn't give a satisfactory answer or doesn't do anything about it, which would be most unusual. But if that were to occur, the citizen can come back to the EPA and make a complaint, and then we would investigate it. What we would do then is write to that local authority, figure out what happened, and make sure that the local authority investigated the complaint. But it is a job for the local authority, and they do it.
You would not, when you say follow-up, you would not do an investigation of the site, or it would just be following up with the
not immediately. Well, it depends on it. Would really depend on the extent of the illegal dumping and the extent of the problem. To be honest with you, we don't have a responsibility to do it. But if a local authority asked us to come out and look at it with them, we certainly would. But in the first instance, the local authority would send people out to the site to investigate it, and they would have to do a report back to us, telling us what they found and what is on the site and what they were going to do about it. And we would, say go ahead and do that if it's the appropriate thing to do. Sometimes the local authority would have the resource, depends on the local authority, how big they are and how well resourced they are. Sometimes they have the resources to do the investigation themselves, and sometimes they might call in a contractor from outside to help them, particularly if there was specialist laboratory or specialist monitoring or sampling to be done, or if they really didn't know what was in the site. Yeah. We, in the meantime, have started up a number of years ago again an environmental enforcement network, which brings together all the enforcement officers of our own agency, the local authority enforcement officers, and brings in people like the Gardaí, which is our police force, the PSNI in Northern Ireland, if they're required, fisheries boards, anybody who really has an interest in, sometimes the health boards, in enforcement. And they work on different priority topics, and one of them has been waste. And so one of the products out of that enforcement network has been a code of practice on how to investigate illegal or unauthorised sites. We did a very big study on unauthorised sites, really trying to, because there was a lot of anecdotal evidence that there's a lot of illegal dumping going on. So we conducted a study of the actual situation, and we followed up on all of that, and to a large extent, or to the biggest extent that possible, we have got rid of illegal dumping on the large scale that it had been going on. And that's not to say, I wouldn't like to get too complacent and say it would never happen again, but certainly the large scale that it was happening has stopped. So we've produced codes of practice for the local authorities in terms of how to investigate, what kind of sampling, how to do all that kind of stuff. So we've much more consistency now across the country, and that's where we see ourselves kind of at a national role, is in setting the guidelines, helping people. For example, we would have helped local authorities where they need it, because some of them are quite big and don't need this, but where they need it, to we would have helped them, training them to produce files for the courts and that, for the Director of Public Prosecutions if they need to take cases to court. So we provide a lot of training in that area through this enforcement network, and it's very well received.
And so it's the EPA is basically an oversight function for the local authorities, but ultimately it's the local authorities who have to take the prosecution.
In those cases.
And you mentioned that sometimes they will ask you to come in and help them. Does that happen fairly often?
It doesn't really happen all that often, but if a local authority was looking for help in a particular case, I'm sure we would provide it to them.
Okay.